Thank you very much. And my great friend Jeff Miller has programmed himself, and indeed Frank and me. He kindly led the charge into what's known in public speaking terms as the death zone, which is straight after lunch, where, you know, the audience can be very soporific from time to time. So if I stop and suddenly utter a loud scream, it will simply be sleepers awake. Well, I was a very wet behind the ears, newly fledged foreign correspondent in 1965, just posted to Singapore from my job as ABC Talks officer in Tasmania. And I was involved in the coverage of the attempted coup, but not in country, as we used to say, on the 30th of September and beyond. So I can only assume that Jeff Miller, who was in Jakarta when it happened, has included me today perhaps as comic relief. I shall do my best. But, you know, what a ludicrous war was Confrontasi. A British artillery officer I spoke to in Sabah on my first familiarisation tour of the area when I first got there in mid-65, described it as a jolly good show, last of the fun wars, old boy. But he wasn't sure what war he'd fight next. We're not in Vietnam, worse luck, probably be some shower of a country in Africa. That's why I'm enjoying this one while it lasts. There was a strong air of unreality over the whole affair. The reluctance of the Indonesian armed forces, the TNI, to engage the Malaysian, British and Australian troops stationed in Borneo was confirmed in later years, when it was revealed that the TNI literally refused to obey orders from Jakarta during 1963 to 1965 Confrontasi, contributing to the Australian and Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific newsletter of November 2001, Group Captain Ian McFarling wrote, "The operational commander, General Suharto, in an act of high treason, sent emissaries to Kuala Lumpur to explain that the TNI was more interested in defeating the communists at home than fighting the British Commonwealth on the Indonesian-Malaysian border." It wasn't long before, in Singapore, we were all immersed in another unexpected major story, when Tunku Abdul Rahman suddenly kicked Singapore out of the new Malaysian Federation. I was unhappily in Tawau in Borneo at the time, about as far away from Singapore as you could get in the then Malaysia. Now, the dust of this was still settling when we journalists were all flat out with another huge and breaking story, the attempted communist coup in Indonesia of September 30, with its attendant massacres of perhaps 500,000 Indonesian, Chinese, suspected communists and sympathisers, or 1 million, as Frank estimates, accompanied by political and social chaos in Jakarta. Now, there were few Western correspondents in Jakarta then. Sukarno had banned the British, of course, but Australians and Kiwis were permitted, even though we had our troops in Borneo occasionally taking pot shots at Indonesian soldiers. The reason for this benevolence undoubtedly harked back to the then Labour government which supported the newly formed Republic of Indonesia in 1945. The Dutch, who were attempting to regain their old colony, were furious. In a show of solidarity, 4,000 Australian wharfies joined Indonesian crew members in a strike, refusing to load Dutch ships carrying arms and supplies, declaring the ships black. Now, this was a high point in Indonesian-Australian relations, which clearly endured up to the time of Confrontasi, and was the reason Australian journalists could work in Indonesia, despite being technically at war with the Republic of Indonesia. Alas, since then, we've run out of brownie points. My fellow Tasmanian colleague, Philip Koch, was still operating from the ABC office in Jakarta, but his problem was to get his material out. The only way was to pigeon his film, audio tape and uncensored copy to Singapore by going to Jakarta airport and asking a passenger, would he or she mind carrying a package for the ABC? Well, can you imagine that in this day and age? Anyway, the people were astonishingly obliging in this regard. The problem in Singapore was that we didn't know which flight Philip's material might be on. So we had a roster going to the airport and importuning arriving passengers as they came out through customs from Jakarta. Excuse me, have you got a package for the ABC? Often the pigeon was looking out for a contact, which made it easier. Others were less obvious. It was time-consuming, tedious, but essential. Now, the first anniversary of the failed communist coup was coming up, and I went to Jakarta to help cover it and then mind the ABC office while our resident correspondent Phil Kosh had a much-needed, well-earned break. At that time, Indonesia was still in chaos with galloping inflation and an unresolved political situation. What became known as the September 30 movement acted when it did, and I'll say this very briefly because we've been through all this, because of rumours of President Sukarno's failing health. The wily old man was deeply compromised by his support of the Indonesian Communist Party, but Indonesia's first president, the man who'd welded together the Indonesian nation after Dutch colonial rule, was widely loved and respected by most Indonesians, his portrait having pride of place on the wall of the humblest atap cottage. Although the president's powers and influence had been much curtailed by the triumvirate of General Suharto, Foreign Minister Adam Malik, and Finance Minister Sultan Hamengkubuwono, they weren't quite confident enough, even a year on, to remove him from the presidency. Student demonstrations supporting the new order were growing in strength and militancy, maintaining a rowdy presence at the gates of the Merdeka presidential palace, and President Sukarno was stirring the pot whenever he could, making inflammatory speeches and refusing to go quietly. The currency had become almost worthless. It was such splendid-looking money, I papered part of a wall in my Singapore flat with it, and it was revalued 1,000 to 1. There were then old rupees and new rupees in circulation at the time, worth about 115 new rupees to the US dollar, or 115,000 in the old currency. People had to carry around suitcases of the stuff. Western visitors to Jakarta all stayed at the Hotel Indonesia, one of the few multi-storey buildings in the Indonesian capital which was air-conditioned and fully functioning. The hotel management didn't muck around with rupees. All transactions were made in United States dollars. The correspondents used to drink in the Ramayana bar, looking down on the traffic that crawled around the circular pond and fountain in front of the building. One evening, Jack Gillen, a Reuters correspondent, noticed a Pertamina oil tanker grinding its way past the hotel. Oil was one commodity that Indonesia had plenty of, and Sukarno had kept the price of petrol and fuel artificially low. At 15 old rupees a gallon, most petrol outlets wouldn't even bother to collect the insignificant amounts owing. Jack calculated that the $2 he'd just paid for his martini in the Ramayana bar would buy the whole tanker load. Things were in such a state that, as Jeff mentioned, the black market, that the Australian Embassy ran its own black market and had its own official money changer and obligingly allowed the ABC to avail itself of this service. As tensions built towards the failed coup anniversary, Sukarno continued to call press conferences and give speeches at the presidential palace. I went to one of these and was privileged to see the president, who had a deserved reputation as a great orator, in full flight, impeccably dressed in military uniform and wearing his trademark black pitchy cap. He spoke from a freestanding microphone. To one side was a small table on which was a glass of fruit juice and a plate of biscuits, which I was told were always there. Sukarno took off his white gloves, laid them down on this little table and his swagger stick, and moved to the microphone, holding the audience in the palm of his hand, even before he started to speak. He began in a low whisper, and then theatrically built his performance, sometimes quoting in English, Dutch, French, or German, or whatever took his fancy. I found it somewhat unnerving that he broke into English to deliver an epigram from Thomas Carlyle. He turned and stared straight at me. Standing to one side were the three men, Suharto, Malik and Hamengkubuwono, who were currently destabilising him. I don't know what he said in Bahasa, but he pointed to them and said something that made all three smile with some irony. Now, Sukarno was always interested in the foreign press and had noticed my new face amongst the gaggle of regulars. He asked to meet me, and I was introduced to him by Hidayat, the ABC interpreter. He wanted to know the obvious things, who I represented and what I was doing in Indonesia. We made some small talk, and he moved on. As the 30th of September anniversary drew closer, the student protests outside the Merdeka Palace intensified. The crack Siliwangi division from outside Jakarta had been brought in for the occasion, and they were itching to get their batons onto the shoulders and heads of the students who'd been massing outside Merdeka Palace for several weeks. I happened to be standing with a group of foreign correspondents, including Phil Kosh, in open parkland between the troops and the students. Suddenly, the Siliwangi soldiers charged, and I turned sideways to turn on my Nagra recorder, which weighed about half a tonne and was, very difficult to carry. But anyway, I got a rifle butt crashed into my back and looked round, and all the soldiers had bayonets fixed. I was lucky I got the wrong end. And we took off without ceremony, running as fast as we could. I took a sideways glance and saw Phil Kosh with a bayonet inches from his bum. It was stinking hot, and the tape recorder seemed to weigh a tonne as we dashed to the edge of the park, fighting for breath, chests bursting. I hadn't run so fast since school athletics. This incident signalled a change of tactics by Suharto's army against the demonstrators, or by the Indonesian army against the demonstrators. Several students were killed in the charge, including 2 girls. No guardsmen were reprimanded, nor was there any subsequent apology to parents for the murder of their children. We were lucky to get out of it unharmed. I hitched a ride on the back of a student's Vespa to get away from the area and back to the office. The troops' action was a message to the students from Suharto that they'd better find some other way of protesting. Well, Australia's foreign policy at that time was presided over by Paul Hasluck, the Minister for External Affairs. Back in Singapore, I joined the jackals of the press at an airport press conference, which consisted of Hasluck walking past a line of journalists ignoring their questions. Paul Hasluck had once been a journalist himself, but this experience had not tempered his later loathing and detestation of the profession, if it can be so called. I managed to get in front of him with my tape recorder, and he paused briefly. Me: "Mr. Hasluck, does the Australian government have any plans to assist Indonesia with the current state of its economy?" Hasluck, irritated: "Look, I'm not going to respond to leading questions like that. There's an assumption in your statement that there is something wrong with the state of the Indonesian economy." It wasn't often that Hasluck invited such a free kick, but we both knew that Indonesia was a financial basket case. Me, disingenuously: "Well, how would you describe the current state of the Indonesian economy, Mr. Hasluck?" Got him. He glared at me and walked on without saying a word. No story, but I didn't care. And that's all I can recall from my cameo role in the now 50 years old attempted communist coup in Indonesia. Thank you for having me.